Happy Tuesday, NCAA basketball fans. This is your weekly Trogcast. That's two really old guys talking NCAA basketball. Old guy number one, Jeff Zink here. And as always, my good partner, old guy number two, Jim Reaker on the other end. Jim, how you doing on this last show of March?
Pretty good. It's a little gloomy today, but we got plenty to talk about with this upcoming Final Four. Been a crazy season. Just to remind the fans, because you sometimes forget everything that happened this year and how crazy it's been. Remember, it all kind of started back in September with the FBI disclosure and the 4 programs that were under scrutiny, which led, of course, to the Hall of Fame Rick Pitino being fired at Louisville. But then we got into the games. Remember the crazy thing that happened in China to UCLA with the shoplifting and LeVar Ball pulling LiAngelo from UCLA and taking him to Lithuania or somewhere to play pro basketball. Crazy. And then remember the Alabama 3-on-5 when they were playing Minnesota in an early tournament and had fouled out all but 3 of their players. And so that's what they'd play with. And they actually almost came back and won that game incredibly. And then the other incredible story, of course, I think was kind of a 2 or 3 day stretch where St. John's upset Duke, who I believe was maybe ranked number 1 at the time, and then turned around and went to Villanova and beat them on their home floor. That was crazy. But it's just been a crazy season. It continues to be crazy. But the story I like, the one we're on right now, the Loyola University of Chicago Ramblers, who have made the Final Four as a number 11, and it's only fitting with this crazy year that some story like this would be there at the end.
Well, it's a good synopsis of a lot of things. Have a lot of nice side stories throughout the year, and of course that'll continue through the year. The coaching carousel in full swing, and yes, Loyola Chicago and the internationally famous Sister Jean making the Final Four, along with names that are there. But we'll get to the Final Four in a little bit. But let's step back just a little bit because we're at that point, like I said, last program of March. So we got to talk about the madness that's going into March. The final game will be played next Monday. So this time next week we will know who the champion is. It is down to 4. But just this time last week we had 16. And let's talk first about those round of 16 games. I don't know how you feel, but I think the 2 sides of the bracket sort of encapsulate exactly what you're talking about, how wacky a season's been. We've used the term wacky many times. On one side, you have a 9 versus a 5, an 11 versus a 7, a 9 versus a 4, and a 3 versus a 7, and the people that come out of that are the 11 and 2 9s along with the 3. And whereas on the other side, it was pretty much by script, except for the Syracuse Orange. You got a 1 versus a 5, a 2 versus a 3, a 1 versus a 5. So, those 1-5s aren't off by much, a 4 over a 5, and then the 2 versus 11. Going back to last Thursday and Friday, and sadly with all the action that happened on Saturday and Sunday, it seems like ancient history. What were some of the most compelling games to you in the Sweet 16?
Well, I had thought Kentucky would maybe make it out of that, and the fact that K-State, a team I had seen out in Las Vegas, that was an amazing game that they were able to hang with all the one-and-doners at UK. Of course, as our friend Joe Moon says, what is it? One and done doesn't get it done when it comes to the NCAA. So I thought that was an interesting game. Of course, Loyola waited. They allowed 6 seconds left in the game before they hit that key shot this time rather than buzzer beater. Those were 2 games I watched that were great games to watch. Florida State, they kind of took care of Gonzaga. I think that was just their athleticism overwhelmed the Zags. Game that really surprised me, although you kind of called it, I know when we were talking last week, was Michigan. They just handled Texas A&M. But again, going back through the whole year, we talk about Texas A&M. They had been Jekyll and Hyde all year long, and Hyde showed up that night, and Michigan took care of them, and they're on a kind of on a roll. Villanova-West Virginia game was an interesting game. West Virginia leading for the majority, but again, it kind of played out like the whole season. It seems like West Virginia pressed Virginia just runs out of gas at the end of a lot of games. And, of course, Nova is a complete team. Purdue, of course, fell. I think a lot of that was because of the loss of their big man who didn't play again. A game that I did not watch, I don't know if you saw it, was closer than I thought. I kind of kept watching the score, and it never really seemed to be close, but the final score, 80-76, was Kansas over Clemson. But Bill Self and the Kansas Jayhawks just seemed to take care of business. And I did watch some of that Duke-Syracuse game, and, again, it's always interesting to watch Jim Boeheim with that zone defense because they gave the Dukies problems, but, of course, their talent with Marvin Bagley III and Gary Trent Jr. and all of those one-and-doners overcame in that game. So there were a lot of interesting matchups there. But but
the thing about me is I think you used the right phrase there, Jekyll and Hyde, not just with Texas A&M, but you look at some of these games, and you're surprised in the Sweet 16. There were some compelling games. Yeah, Loyola Chicago went down to one of the last shots again. I want to talk about their run in a little bit. The Kansas State-Kentucky game ended up 3 points, but it really wasn't that close. So what's getting me is, Villanova won by 12, Texas Tech by 13, Michigan by 27, Florida State by 15. It's just amazing, and this can happen. You get a team hot on a run. But, I go back to I think this just sort of is a tournament, and some people, are asking, is it the best one ever? I think it's the most fun one we've had in a long time watching some of this stuff. But it's just like some of these games aren't games, and others of them are very exciting. At least it was in the Sweet 16. I mean, you did have some good games. That Duke-Syracuse game, they know each other very well. That went down to the end. You were talking about, the Kansas-Clemson game. I did watch a lot of that, and Clemson just would not go away. And they're a team that could have ended up in the Final Four as well, as hot as they were. They just kept clawing and kept clawing. So you had those close games like the Kansas-Clemson, but other than the Loyola Chicago game, not a lot of these games were really all that close.
Yeah, you're right. And it's interesting. I always think that those Thursday, Friday games all through the tournament are interesting in the fact that those teams have some time to prepare for their opponent. And I think sometimes coaching wins out in that first round. Second round is a little bit tougher because it's a quick turnaround. You don't know who you're going to play. You can't prepare for that until really about 24, 36 hours before it happens. So, again, I guess it takes good coaching to be able to prepare a team on short notice. But I think there's just two different feels for those games. One, again, is you have a lot of time to prepare, a lot of time to scout and know what you're up against. And the second one, again, is kind of a quick turnaround. You got to sleep sometimes, so that even lessens the preparation and practice time for not only the coaches but the players themselves.
But you also know those directors of baseball operations, which are basically interns, they're in there running film on both teams, but it is hard until whereas that leads us into the Elite Eight games, which to me were very different. And, other than the Villanova-Texas Tech game, which Villanova seemed to have control from the beginning, there's a bigger gap to the Loyola Chicago-Kansas State game. But if you watch that, it was a lot closer than that. It was like 65-62. At one point, then Loyola hit a big three-point shot, and then it was just multiple trips to the foul line and Kansas State throwing up threes. So that was a much tighter game. So all four games, when you look, Kansas Duke going overtime, and you got a chance to watch that game, that was one of those things where neither team deserved to lose. And the Florida State-Michigan game, again, battling down to the end with two wizened coaches. So that, I think, does contribute to what you're talking about in the quick turnaround. But looking at those four games, I'm sure you probably saw a lot of both of them, of all four of them. But what's neat about that is, again, I go back to, you look at the two sides, and it's the South with the West and the East with the Midwest. It's just wraps up the season that you got 2 9s and 11 on one side, and it's a 1 and a 3 and a 1 and a 2 on the other side. Of course, you knew a 9 or 11 was going to go through, but then the 3 prevailed. there. So the Final Four, when we talk about that, kind of settled things down. But, what a neat story. 2 9s and an 11 out of 3 teams on one side, but much, much more interesting and tighter games in the Elite Eight.
Yeah, and I'm going to say, and again, qualify what I'm going to say here, that the teams aside and your feelings about them, that Kansas-Duke game was maybe the best game of the whole tournament. You had some very, very talented players, a lot of them who will be in the NBA next year, just going punch for punch. That game was back and forth, and both teams trying to exploit their strengths they had, and in fact there was some question of why Duke didn't go to Marvin Bagley III more, because it seemed like anytime he got his hands on the ball 5 to 10 feet from the basket, it was almost an automatic 2 points, and maybe they should have pounded that a little bit more. But the shooting of Devontae Graham and actually Malik Newman, an unheralded hero coming up, the transfer from Mississippi State. In fact, I think he had 13 points in the overtime, just went off.
He had all of Kansas's points in the overtime.
Yeah. And so that game was just that was a phenomenal game. I think, again, I would almost call it the best game of the tournament so far. Yeah, that Loyola game, that the thing that struck me is this team is playing well together, and they are maybe the best team, so to speak. They complement each other so well. There isn't just one guy that you have to try to stop in order to stop them, and they're hot at the right time, that's for sure. Hitting shots and finding easy shots. The Michigan Florida State game, Florida State, their magic kind of ran out. They were, I think, a little bit more athletic, but again, Michigan's just a team that has been on a roll lately, rolling through the Big Ten tournament and just playing very, very well. And again, playing very, very well as a team. And then my final take is Villanova. That may have this is the thing that strikes me and will lead to what I'm going to say later when we talk about the Final Four. That may have been the worst game Villanova's played, definitely in the tournament, if not all year. They shot, I think, I read somewhere 18% from the three-point line, and we know that's a big part of their game. But the fact that they were able to win by 12 points on one of their worst shooting days just shows you what kind of team they are. And a lot of it is their defense, which, again, Jay Wright has always stressed, and we've heard him harp this year many, many times. This team isn't playing as good a defense as we're used to, and I think he's getting them to that point. And, again, with the experience they have and the talent they have, you always say that when you win a national championship, you got to get through one of those ugly games or get lucky maybe. I don't even know if they got lucky, but they got through a very ugly game, and I think they're going to be tough to beat in the Final Four.
And let's transition right into that, because a lot of things you said about those Elite Eight games, I've already alluded to some great games, but now we're down to the guys going to San Antonio. It's the media darlings, Loyola Chicago. Michigan, who I think has won 12 straight now, ran through the Big Ten +4 tournament and now through the NCAAs. Villanova might be, even though as good as they're playing, I heard a stat, and I haven't had a chance to double check it, that they haven't won by less than double digits in March. They might be the team that's coming into the Final Four the quietest because of the hoopla about the other games. And, of course, Kansas scrapping their way in. So got to give you credit. You've got 2 of your 4 choices in the Final Four. I've only got 1 from the beginning. Of course, your 2 guys are going to play each other. But let's go with this a little bit and talk about what you think are some of the strengths of the game. Of course, we know in a one-and-done tournament, anything can happen. I mean, Butler has taught us that, and George Mason, and the great Villanova, NC State. You can be the best team in this tournament and even get to the Final Four and not win it. So any of the 4 could win it, but you've got strengths on one side or another. So what's your head telling you? What's your heart telling you about these 4 teams?
Well, I like the matchups and the fact that one game is kind of the two teams that don't have the big stars and are playing very well together as teams, that being Loyola and Michigan. And then the other side, you got some people don't like the term, but the Blue Bloods, although I don't know, Villanova's kind of a Johnny-come-lately blue blood, so to speak, but have been at the top of the basketball world for the last 4 or 5 years. Just two interesting games, and I think two very good matchups. And this is one of those years that some people may say, based on the seeding, based on the coaching, that the championship's going to be won in the semifinal round in that Villanova-Kansas game. I think that's just going to be a great game because, again, both of them shoot the three ball well usually. Both of them are so well coached. You know, you could make an argument that Jay Wright and Bill Self are the two best coaches in the country right now. And so that's going to be a great game. And the other game I think is going to be a great game to see who plays team ball. My worry about Loyola is they wake up and go, what the heck, we're in the Final Four. And, again, the media, of course, is focusing on them and Sister Jean, and everybody's talking about the 63 championship and and they've captured the imagination of the country. You just hope that they don't get too caught up in it and continue to play the type of basketball they've played. You know, it's just a great story, and college basketball needed something like this with all the scandal that's been going on. An alleged scandal through the year. Just a great story. You look at their coach, Porter Moser. He's 14 years as a head coach. He's never been to the NCAA tournament. And really, if you look at his resume, he hasn't had that great of a run as a head coach. In fact, he was fired somewhere down the line. And actually, I think maybe one of the keys is he spent some years with some final years of Rick Majerus' life with him at St. Louis as one of his assistants, and a lot of people see the kind of offense he's running, the system he's running is some stuff that he learned from Majerus, who we know is a great coach through his coaching career. So, again, one game of kind of the team play, see who wins that one. Some great stories there, and then the other game is the Blue Bloods. And then, of course, it kind of sets up for that if Loyola makes it through. If they win on Saturday, they will be the first number 11 to make it to a final game, and that's the lowest seed ever. So they'll make history if they can just beat Michigan. But, again, a lot of people I think it would be a great story if they would somehow pull off this Final Four. I don't know if that's possible. Again, Villanova and Kansas are just so good, and they just have so much more athletic ability and, future NBA stars. But it kind of reminds me, the game that we always talk about, the North Carolina State Wolfpack when they went against Phi Slamma Jamma and, no chance in the world. And, again, what a great story that was. So maybe we're looking at a feel-good here.
Yeah, well, you hope to. Your heart is definitely with Loyola Chicago.
Exactly.
I always go with whenever my teams are out, I always like to root for the team that's never won a championship. Now, all of these teams have won championships. Nova, multiple ones. Kansas, multiple ones. So I got to go with Loyola Chicago because it's been the longest since 1963, and they're definitely the feel-good story, like you said, of the season. What you like about them, and I do, and this is why my heart also goes to them, is this is what college basketball should be all about. We spend too much time talking about the one-and-dones, like I said, the blue bloods and the money and who pays what. These kids from Loyola Chicago, some of them are going to go play pro, but it might be in South America or Israel or Europe or Asia. They're not NBA stars. They've all stayed there through the program. The coach is a lifer. Who knows if he's going to stick around after this run, as often happens. But you've got to go with the Ramblers and the feel good. And they're playing with house money. I mean, they may wake up, like you said, and say, oh, what the hell, we're in the Final Four. But that's not the way they're talking. They're like, hey, you have to beat us. But they have had, if you want to call it, a fairly easy run, a shaky Miami team. Tennessee probably a shaky number 3. just escaped from Nevada and then, to play a 9 to get into it, that's going to be different than playing a 3 and possibly a 1. So I'm with you. You would love to see that happen. And just getting to San Antonio, they're going to sell plenty of Sister Jean bobbleheads and T-shirts, and their admissions are going to go through the roof, as often happens. But your head has to go in a different direction. So I definitely think Michigan is going to take them. John Beilein, he was just in the final game a few years ago. They were in the 13 final that, of course, now has been vacated by Louisville, and they lost by 6. So he knows what's there. He's going to know about the hype. Of course, Jay Wright just won it 2 years ago. You talk about the coaches, and of course, Bill Self not only has his victory in 2008, but he lost in the final game in 2012. So that's what I think comes down to, is the management of the players. Loyola Chicago is going to go and have a good time, but the other 3 teams are there and know why they're there, and their coaches know how to deal with all the distractions that are going to be there. So I'm pretty sure that Michigan is going to top Loyola Chicago. That's what my head says. But again, it's one of those seasons where you never know. Now, on the other side, when teams like Kansas and Villanova play each other, it's hard. You look at that Kansas and Duke game. I say neither team deserved to lose. There was a charge blocked foul that could have gone either way, and Duke could have gone up 6 or 7. Grayson Allen's shot hit everything but the bottom of the net there as the buzzer went off, or Duke wins it. Malik Newman not quite as hot, and those sorts of things can happen in any game. But your head has to go to Villanova. I mean, like I said, they won by 12. They won by 12. They won by 13. They won by 26 just in the NCAAs. Whereas, Kansas got by Duke. They just got by Clemson by 4. They even had a tight game against Seton Hall, and for a while there, Penn was playing with them. So it could be, you say, they're used to those tight games, and it could be that their string has run out. But for me, I would have to say that it's going to be a Michigan-Villanova final. Now, you didn't go quite that far. You kind of
thinking with my head, yeah, that's what I'm. And I would pick Nova to win the game. Here's just a couple points about Loyola, though, going in. Just some things to, the experience factor. But I think I read somewhere 6 or 7 of these Loyola players played on high school state championship teams, which says to me they've been on the big stage, so to speak, of course, at a lower level. So maybe the bright lights don't affect them, and maybe even it's the bright lights that bring out the best in some of these guys. And then I was reading a story this morning. I thought this was interesting. I believe it was, because they're not household names yet even, but I believe it was Ben Richardson, a very talented high school player who, again, I think is from somewhere in Illinois, won an Illinois state championship, but was asked why he chose to go to Loyola. I believe he had some offers from some schools that would be, more a better basketball school, so to speak. And he said, every time I met with Coach Moser, I just felt his passion. And that passion drew me in. And again, he's been there for 4 years, and you look at the last 4 years, I don't think they've even had a winning record all 4 of those years, and have just gotten a little bit better and a little bit better. In fact, he said, if you told me at the beginning of the season we'd be in the Final Four, I told you were crazy. So those are just a couple things that, again, maybe this is the year that Cinderella really pulls off the big upset. And again, just for college basketball's sake, it's a great story. Even if it doesn't play out, but if it would play out, they would win a national championship. In fact, I read someone said this would be bigger than the Cubs winning the World Series, just to put it in perspective.
Well, you got to love it when the Chicago gets behind you, and they're not known as a college basketball town much anymore since DePaul has taken its dive. Northwestern got them going last year. You got the Bulls championships there, but the third largest city in the country getting behind them, you really got to love that. I think this is another factor. It's not as big of a factor, but it's one of those things going in that Nova and Kansas both have multiple championships now. whereas Loyola and Michigan don't. Getting that second championship puts you in an elite thing. There's only 15 programs that have 2 or more. So that's a little added pressure onto Michigan and Loyola Chicago to get that second one in there. But on the other side is the pressure on the 2 coaches for the teams that have multiple championships, Bill Self and Jay Wright, because they're hoping to join an elite band of only 14 coaches that have won 2 or more championships. They each have one, like I said earlier, Self's in 08, and we alluded to Wright's in 16. And sometimes, like players, put a little extra pressure on themselves. Maybe the coach is thinking, hey, I can take that step up. It's on their mind. You can't just dismiss it, and they're professional enough to probably not. But to join that group of 14 guys, to become the 15th one to win your second championship, that's Nirvana-type territory.
Yeah. And I'm just looking forward to that Nova-Kansas game and the fact that 2 great tacticians and see how they attack each other and react to what they do. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be a fun one to watch. But,
well, I got a feeling they're both going to be good games in San Antonio the Saturday. Changing back to the way they've been. It's Saturday night. I believe the first game starts around 6, and then the second game will start 25 minutes after that. They have it listed right now for 8:49 on the East Coast, and that's just good watching of basketball on Saturday night, and then the championship game will be on Monday night. And while we're on the topic of the Final Four, we can't forget that there's another Final Four going on much closer to home, just an hour and a half drive north of us here, Jim. The women's NCAA will be playing their Final Four in Columbus, and they've rolled out quite the opposite. All 4 number 1 seeds have made the Final Four, and that's the UConn Huskies, Notre Dame, Mississippi State, who knocked off the Huskies last year before South Carolina won, and then it's not all bad news for basketball in Louisville because their women's team is at the Final Four. So we can't forget that side of NCAA basketball as well, and we wish them all well. Of course, it looks like Gino Auriemma has another juggernaut with his squad. But like I say, Mississippi State took them down last year to keep them from winning the championship, and Notre Dame has won a championship. So there'll be some great basketball. Now, their games are Friday and Sunday to stay away from the men. So if you're looking for a little bit more of a basketball fix this weekend, check out some of the women's games.
Yeah, and of course UConn's been the UCLA of women's basketball for the last decade or more.
Mm-hmm. So that's good stuff. We both picked our champion. We think it's going to be Jay Wright and the Villanova Wildcats, and that's without any of our Big East bias from our Razorcast. Well, I really think they have shown that they are the best team in the country, but like we also said, the best team doesn't always win. But any of the 4 teams there would be worthy championships, having great seasons, and are pretty much classy programs with great coaches that do things the right way. Anything else?
We're agreeing. That's
yeah.
News right there.
Well, sometimes I just disagree with you to keep it fun, but this time I figured I'd just go ahead. But it doesn't matter. You go back and look at my bracket, it got busted in the first weekend. It's like, as a lot of people's did. I think going into the Sweet 16, the ESPN Challenge only had like 31 out of close to 4 million brackets that had a chance to be perfect, and that was blown in the Elite Eight. So it just goes in with that pattern that we were talking about of a wacky year in college basketball. And we'll finish this one and then get ready for the next one. Anything else before we go on to the final segment, our trivia and tidbits?
Nope, I think we've covered it well, and just have to see how it all plays out.
All right. Well, what have you got for me this time?
Well, I'm focusing on the Loyola Ramblers here a little bit and some trivia from Loyola, and I got a few different questions and some tidbits, a little history here. First of all, I was looking for the most famous alum of Loyola University of Chicago. And, of course, many in different areas. But in my view, the most famous was a television actor who was on a sitcom, big-time sitcom, for many years, and then actually had his own sitcom show later, which was called The Blank Blank Show, named after him. You know who I'm talking about?
The Blank Blank Show. Yeah, I guess telling me you would kind of give it away. Before I go into it, and that's all this time, Loyola Chicago is a great university. It's tucked in there on the lake in between the city and Evanston, where Northwestern is greater known, and it has produced a lot of different people. But the person you're referring to, and I remember because I know he's from around that city, and he not only had one show that was the Blank Blank Show, but he had two, and that's the amazingly hilarious comedian Bob Newhart.
You got it. Good job. Yeah, I saw a lot of people, a lot of actors and writers, probably some that you know more than I do, given your background and interest. A lot of academics come out of that school, and and actually the school, I believe, has 2 or 3 campuses. I think they also have a campus down around the Water Tower and the Magnificent Mile also, besides the one. I think the main one is out just south of Evanston, just south of Northwestern there on the lake. Right there on Sheridan. It has an amazing arts program, so you got a lot of theater folks there. It's been well known for its radio station, was one of the first run by students in the country. Music programs. It just is all around education. Obviously, with a name like Loyola, it focuses on the Jesuit side of it. It's a good school, so I'm glad they're getting a little of their recognition now. And like I say, as often happens, it's happened with George Mason and DCU and a lot of others, you're going to see an immense increase in their applications next year because they're getting their name out there. Good. Actually, I just missed this. Let's go back to basketball for a second in history, and of course you know that they won their national championship in 1963 with what most considered was an upset, although it was definitely, in my study of them, a very, very good team. Beat your UC Bearcats, who were going for a three-peat with Ed Jucker as their coach. But here was my question. They did beat UC, I believe it was overtime, 60-58 for that national championship. Who did they beat in the semifinal game in 1963? A team we've talked a little bit about today, a program anyway.
Well, that would be, if we talked about them.
We talked about a lot.
Yeah, that's the problem. You didn't give me much of a hint on
They
that
were in
one.
the Sweet 16. I'll give you this. They were in the Elite Eight.
They were in the Elite Eight. Then it would probably have been Michigan or Kansas back in the 60s. No,
Duke.
It was Duke.
They beat Duke in the national semifinals 94-75. Put it on the Blue Devils. And actually the Blue Devils had the National Player of the Year. I think his name was Hyman. I never really had heard of him. But again, those are a few years back.
Well, they did well. They not only they came back for the next couple of years and did well in the 60s, and then were out of the tournament for a long time before this run. So they're happy to do it. And they but if you know your Rambler athletics, they do have two other more recent national championships, but it's in men's volleyball in 14 and 15. So
I did. I actually did run across that. A few other tidbits about the Ramblers. Just again, well, here's the thing. We think of them as a small, as we do most, Jesuit university. They are actually, I believe, the largest Jesuit university in the country. They actually have over 16,000 students, undergrad, I believe. So, although that's still small in comparison to some of the major universities like Kansas. and Michigan being one of the largest. Sister Jean, of course, as you mentioned, her marketing has gone through the roof. Bobbleheads, they actually had a Sister Jean bobblehead day 6 or 7 years ago at one of the games, and they've actually put that back out there and have had all kinds of orders. And, of course, T-shirts, she gave the okay to market herself, and all the money is being donated to, or most of the money is being donated to the Loyola Athletic Fund, although some of it's going to a couple of her favorite charities also. But worship, work, and win is her motto, and you probably see a lot of those T-shirts this weekend. Another little tidbit on the basketball side, Loyola actually holds the largest margin of victory in any NCAA game. And that was in that 63 season. In the first round, they played Tennessee Tech and beat them 111-42. That's the largest margin in the history of the tournament. And mascot. Well, I told you. We talked
you covered that, and I covered the big margin last week. Come on now, you're repeating yourself. What do you got that's fresh?
Now, this is new stuff on the mascot. Actually, the original mascot, back in the 20s, they were called the Maroon and Gold for obvious reasons. And actually, that was kind of a common thing back in the 20s. And, of course, we still have the Harvard Crimson, who still uses that. But a lot of teams did that. Again, they became the Ramblers, if you didn't listen to that edition, because their football team, their 1925 football team, was going all over the country to play and rambling about. So that's where that name actually came from, the football team, which actually only lasted into the 1930s, but all their athletic teams continued to have the name Rambler. They didn't have an actual mascot, though, until 1980. And the initial mascot, this is kind of hilarious, was a hobo. And his name was Bo Rambler, and was very, very popular. Guy dressed up like a hobo and came to the games, and he was the mascot. The university thought maybe that image wasn't the most positive for a Jesuit university to have. So in the 90s, they started to look for a new one, and, of course, that's when they came up with, for no unknown reason except that somebody decided it was a good idea, the wolf that we see now as their mascot. And actually, do you know what the wolf's name is? He has a name, just like the musketeer is
Fred,
Canadian.
Barney, Wilma, Betty. No, none of those.
His name is Lou Rambler. Lou being spelled L-U. Ha-ha. So I think that's about all I got on the Ramblers there. So
I was going to say, I don't think there's much left to say about other than to go up and visit. Beautiful campus there on the lake shore of Chicago. If you get a chance, you're driving up there, stop in and visit. Not very well, big or stretched out, but a beautiful place.
Actually, they were an original member of the MCC with Xavier that ultimately became the Horizon, and they actually left the Horizon to replace Creighton in the Missouri Valley when Creighton went to the Big East with Xavier in 2013. So it all is tied together.
And remember, there are 3 other teams in the Final Four as well: Michigan, Villanova, and but where do we go? We get those kind of great stuff. Again, we'll be back on the air next week for our final Trogcast, knowing how the Final Four worked out, both in Columbus and in San Antonio. A couple other little tidbits here on my end. Happy 56th birthday yesterday to John Stockton, a 10-time NBA All-Star, member of the Naismith Hall of Fame. He made his mark in college by being the 3rd generation of Stocktons to attend Gonzaga University, where he's named Western Coast Conference Player of the Year 1984, leading the Bulldogs to their best record in over 17 years. He spent his entire professional career with Utah Jazz, and even though he's been retired for 15 years, still holds the NBA assist records. And a big week for him this week. His son Dave, up on a 10-day contract, played for the Utah Jazz just the day before yesterday. So 3 generations at Gonzaga, 2 generations at Utah. And we can say happy birthday for a long time ago to Major League Hall of Famer manager Miller Huggins. He's a Cincinnati native and a UC graduate. Started his career at the Reds, but made his name as the manager of the New York Yankees, building the great Murderers Row teams of 27 and 28. Won the World Series 3 times. Passed away, unfortunately, at the tender age of 51, but he is buried here in Cincinnati's famed Spring Grove Cemetery. A couple other nice little things here. In 1926 was the death of Georges Vezina, famed goalie for the Montreal Canadiens, for whom the Vezina Trophy, which is given to the best goalie in the NHL, is named. And this time last year, on this date, we lost one of the track and field great personalities, Brian Oldfield, who created the introduction of the spin movement for shot putters, similar to the hammer throw or the discus. And he set many unofficial records in the shot put in the 70s and early 80s. But because he had joined the professional track circuit, none of them are listed. And I added that pertinent because, unfortunately, the great Katie Ledecky has now given up her amateur status in order to get commercial endorsements and will no longer swim for Stanford. So things we've been fighting for decades are still going on. A couple little neat things that I found, too. In 1931, on this date, John McGraw of the New York Giants, the famed MLB manager, said, "Night baseball will never catch on." So he couldn't be right about anything. And Jim, what is key about March 27th in NCAA history? The basketball tournament.
March 27th in NCAA history.
You have repeated the question correctly.
Do I get a hint?
Okay, I'll give you the year, 1939.
It was the first final game in NCAA tournament history.
You are correct. It was 1939, 79 years ago today. Oregon beat Ohio State in the very first men's basketball final. We wish all the teams good luck as they go through the Final Four, and we thank you all for listening. And we will be back on the air on Tuesday with our final Trogcast of the year.